Who else is to blame for the riots that swept the United Kingdom earlier this month? The men and women now behind bars for serious offences occasioned during the disturbances are front and centre in the Hall of Shame. But Liberal radio host James O'Brien says Nigel Farage, leader of Reform UK, should also take his share of the blame, after having built his multi-decade political brand on coded appeals to anti-migrant bigotry. In the hours after the Southport murders, Farage amplified misinformation that the knife man was a Muslim migrant. When White Britons later bricked police officers, pelted mosques with masonry and set ablaze hotels housing asylum seekers, the Clacton MP walked back his commentary and speculation, claiming he has never encouraged non-democratic means in his campaign against uncontrolled immigration. "I've never been involved in violence, been involved in street protest, been involved in encouraging any of these things," Farage told Talk TV on August 8. "No, Mr. Farage. This just won't do." Nigel Farage cannot so easily wriggle his way out of responsibility for the chaos of early August. James O'Brien's Twitter X feed quotes Farage as saying in 2017, "If they don't deliver this Brexit that I spent 25 years of my life working for, then I will be forced to don khaki, pick up a rifle and head for the front lines." Farage is rightly damned by his own words. His 25-year record of incitement litters the social media timelines of many of the people who participated in the riots, some of whom are now serving long sentences of imprisonment. Tommy Robinson's incendiary witterings may also have brought the rioters onto Britain's streets. He was adding to his Twitter X feed from a Cyprus Sun lounger, as many of those who follow his lead were throwing missiles at the police. Andrew Tate is on the radar of investigators too, as they examine the words of the online distributors of hate, with a view to prosecution. Tate, himself a Muslim and a migrant in Romania, used his considerable social media weight to falsely identify the Southport murderer as a Muslim migrant. He was able to do so, in part, because Twitter X gives him a platform. That's the responsibility of the irresponsible Elon Musk, the meddling social media boss, whose extraordinary wealth and strategic American businesses put him out of reach of British justice. Mainstream politicians from the ranks of the Conservative Party must also be included in this rogues gallery. Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, Sala Braverman and Priti Patel among others, whipped up anti-migrant hysteria as a deliberate electoral strategy over 14 years, and we have all now reaped the whirlwind. Sunak, Britain's first non-white prime minister, staked his political reputation on stopping the small boats. He was sunk by his failure and disowned by the British electorate. Braverman salivated with joy at the prospect of migrants being deported to Rwanda, a policy that first gained legs under her predecessor as Home Secretary, Priti Patel. Johnson's list of anti-black and anti-Muslim insults may have been comedy gold for some among the UK's ruling class, but they were no laughing matter for the people of colour who were victims of the spike in hate crime that followed his shameless mockery. After the 2011 UK riots, the country's then Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron addressed the British Parliament on how the country would respond to the nationwide disturbances, which he described as pure criminality. Standing at the House of Commons dispatch box, Cameron said, "Our security fightback must be matched by a social fightback. We know what's gone wrong, the question is, do we have the determination to put it right?" Cameron asked one of the most important questions of his 6 years in office. Successive Conservative administrations failed to deliver an answer, nor did they show any real commitment to the cause of social justice and equality. Instead, confronted by the rising social costs of 40 years of economic austerity, the Conservative Party sought to distract voters by pointing to migrants as the visible manifestation of the country's ills. Should we be now surprised that the current crop of UK rioters came from 7 of the 10 most deprived areas in Britain? They are the left-behind casualties of Britain's squandered North Sea oil inheritance, the elite's decision to abandon manufacturing and industry, and cross-party acceptance of the tyranny of shareholders and casino bank speculation. The rioters blamed migrants for their misery, even though the spark of the disturbances had little to do with migration and everything to do with Britain's violent male culture. The rioters cared so little for their own futures that they committed serious crimes in full view of the police and allowed their acts to be recorded on smartphones, to be later exploited for clicks and views on social media. One buffoon, made famous by his pillaging of a shoe store, offered his autograph to probation service staff before being imprisoned for 3 years. The rioters refused to accept that their poverty and desperate life chances are the results of decisions taken by rich men on Mediterranean yachts, and not by desperately poor men in dinghies in the English Channel. But how and why did they arrive at this conclusion? And who made them so brazen in their actions, so careless in their online behavior, and by all accounts, so utterly without a shred of remorse? One explanation is the failure of the British left to provide a critique of the previous 40 years that working-class whites find convincing. How could the left fail to persuade the jobless and the working poor that they were paying the price for the ruling class obsession with profit? Why couldn't the left connect successfully job losses to the stacks of cash filling the accounts of people who would later present themselves as the populist defenders of impoverished workers? The answers to these questions are for another podcast. If the rioters were the torpedoes of sections of the British ruling class, they were also the useful idiots of the mainstream media, responsible for 40 years of mass hypnosis that has delivered the worst unrest in more than a decade. The legacy media will be keen to have the fingers of blame point in other directions, but its role as a foot soldier for the likes of Farage, Tommy Robinson, and others cannot be ignored. The media gave Farage a consistent platform over decades and indulged Robinson, all in the name of impartiality, objectivity, and ratings. The media's long-standing mix of xenophobia and anti-blackness is of such potency that it serves as a model for the output of social media content makers. As British society changed and the audience for print and broadcast products dwindled, the UK media was forced to refine its recipe. With overt anti-blackness less acceptable, the legacy media now serves readers and viewers a justification for prejudice that is less obvious but every bit as vicious, which we shall call consensus racism. At its core, consensus racism says society is polarized and communities live separately because immigrants don't want to integrate. Consensus racism builds on the perception that identity politics have replaced in importance the economic ordering of the country, and implicitly suggests that white people should stand up to non-white domination by self-segregating as a means of self-defense. Legacy media adopted consensus racism as an editorial philosophy and created a business model that would allow it to compete with social media and give it a share of the emerging attention economy, whilst also offering plausible deniability that its programming was stoking bias. The subject material of consensus racism identifies white Britons as victims in their own land. It fuels the suspicion that there is no free speech in the country. Patriots are persecuted and harassed by the police and the courts, even though these defenders are the last hope before the country is hijacked by non-whites. Sometimes this programming requires a multi-ethnic, multi-faith cooperation that endorses traditional anti-black, anti-Muslim talking points. Prominence is given to black presenters who discuss matters of race, migration, and integration with the factual accuracy of a golf club bore. Occasionally, black conservative commentators are invited to attack the so-called woke religion as the enemy of the fight against racism. Consensus racism sometimes gives voice to so-called migrant patriots, who reinforce the widely held belief that non-white culture is at the heart of social unrest and criminality. News and discussion programs once tackled race matters solely from the point of view of the majority white population, sending a clear message to politicians that non-white newcomers were too numerous, too dangerous, and an unwanted nuisance. Over time, non-whites were included for their polarizing potential. Community spokesmen would indict the host country's key institutions for their racism, only to be cast as bitter and resentful. Their role was to confirm in the public's mind that they were representatives of communities which were ungrateful and impossible to assimilate. This formula lasted until the beginning of this century. By then, government repatriation policies had withered. Black Zionist movements had largely disappeared too, and multicultural politics had risen to give hope to non-whites that the struggles of the past were over. Non-whites became more vocal and aggressive in their demands for full citizenship, as urban unrest in Britain and France amply demonstrated. The media could no longer produce programs that treated non-whites as new arrivals who might go home voluntarily or compulsorily. Consensus racism altered the format for reporting on race issues whilst offering a certain message continuity. Consensus racism is informed by the increasing prominence of the clash of civilizations theory, which overwhelmed the American right in the late 1990s, as a plausible rationale for perpetual war and the confiscation of Middle East oil resources. The clash of civilizations theory established the currency that Christians and Muslims were so different that they would be engaged in a perpetual social Darwinist struggle to the finish. The theory achieved the status of quasi-truth after the September 11 catastrophe, the subsequent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the hundreds of Islamist terror attacks around the world. It cast the Christian West as the victims of an invasion by Muslims. As the West's birth rate plunged, the Great Replacement conspiracy became political orthodoxy. And now, a generation later, we have the spectacle of white people rioting in dozens of cities in the United Kingdom, in part to stop the boats which transport Muslims into the country. Consensus racism is deployed as a rebuke of anti-racist identity politics, which have come to define Western democracies since the mass arrival and settlement of non-white peoples. For the curmudgeonly, anti-racism was also a useful cover for the security-first approach to former colonial subjects, which militarized ghettos, filled prisons, and maintained the status quo, even as it trumpeted the prospect of social inclusion. That said, it was anti-racism that gave birth to multiculturalism, that in turn has given us wokeism, diversity, inclusion, and equity initiatives and Black and ethnic minorities in positions of influence. These changes provoked a political backlash. The hard right, organized around long-standing anti-Blackness, found a new rallying cry in the fight against the Muslim invaders. The political class saw the political value of not challenging the demonization of all Muslims for the actions of a tiny minority. The media piled in, boosting hard right talking points and pointing its audience in the direction of right-wing firestarters. And no outlet in Britain currently does this better than GB News and Talk TV. GB News has a YouTube subscriber base of more than 1,370,000. Talk TV can count on more than 1 million followers for its videos. Here is a sample of the videos it offers. Alex Phillips rants, "Call me a racist, I don't care," on immigration and crime. Bricks thrown, huge urban violence. Migrants and police clash in France over channel crossings. Total thuggery, ex-detective warns UK riots could explode again. Racist, violence, and explode again, the keywords of its mischief, are capitalized for added effect. This is a media company which knows its audience and understands that fear and hatred are essential to its survival. After being caught by surprise by the rioting, Talk TV is not at all embarrassed by its content strategy. Its presenters, chief among them Alex Phillips, simply state that they abhorred the violence, before offering a certain legitimacy to the rioters' grievances, doubling down on the anti-migrant, multiculturalism has failed idiocy that inspired the chaos. Neither GB News nor Talk TV would exist without these brand obsessions. They give them social media reach in the form of clips and reels. The themes provide cover. The outlets are not promoting discord, but are merely tackling issues which other broadcasters refuse to discuss. This in turn gives GB News and Talk TV a claim to authenticity. They speak for the silent majority of concerned ordinary citizens. We saw the faces of these ordinary people this month, as we witnessed their violence, looting, burning, and anti-Muslim pogroms. Most of us were appalled. Were GB News and Talk TV similarly appalled? Did these channels see in the burning buildings, the frightened police officers and street thuggery, the fruits of their daily encouragement to disorder? Or, as the prison door slams shut on inmates who surely share their programming priorities, are the media executives working for GB News and Talk TV, not to mention the Daily Mail, the Sun, and the Telegraph newspapers, simply rubbing their hands with glee? These are questions for a future podcast. Until then, thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe for future podcasts and join me again next time.